Here are the topics that will be covered in the US pressure groups revision video. This video is continuing at looking at the power of pressure groups with a focus on PACS and super PACS. Another area of power of the pressure groups is looking at PACS and super PACS, so we must look at the funding of pressure groups. US pressure groups collectively spend millions of dollars in electoral finance, helping to get political candidates elected. They naturally focus their efforts on candidates who share their aims, so unions, pro-choice, LGBTQ+, and gun control groups tend to support Democratic candidates, while conservative religious groups, pro-life, and gun rights groups generally fund Republican candidates. We're going to focus on the NRA as a case study for the funding of pressure groups. With around 5 million members, the NRA is seen as one of the most powerful pressure groups in US politics, largely because of its strategy of funding election campaigns. Its tactics have developed over time. In 1992, 37% of its congressional campaign spending went to Democrat candidates. As politics became more polarized, the NRA increasingly focused its efforts on Republican candidates, who then received 98% of their funding. However, it is not entirely partisan. The NRA has spent money in primaries opposing moderate Republicans. In 2012, it spent more than $169,000 successfully opposing the reselection of Senator Richard Lugar, who did not join the NRA. The NRA has also made donations to the Democrats, most notably the Blue Dog faction of the party. In 2016, they spent $52.5 million on electoral campaigning. However, it is worth noting that its electoral interventions have not automatically increased its power. Its revenue fell in 2016 to 2018. After spending $30 million promoting Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, the NRA did not enjoy his unconditional support as it expected. In March 2019, the NRA said it was disappointed that the Trump administration had introduced a national ban on bump stocks, devices that can be attached to semi-automatic rifles to make them fire faster. The NRA is a good case study to know. Alongside this, you need to be aware of how pressure groups are funded. There are three main categories: the funding of Washington insiders, reinforcing incumbency, and iron triangles, including defense, the military-industrial complex, and drug companies, otherwise known as Big Pharma. When looking at the power of pressure groups and looking at their funding of PACs and super PACs, there are the three main areas that were discussed on the previous slide. We're going to start by looking at the funding of Washington insiders. Pressure groups focus their resources on key figures in Washington. In presidential years, much of their funding is spent on the campaigns of the main two presidential candidates, as the winner will have sole federal executive power. They also spend heavily on campaigns of influential individuals within Congress, including high-profile party members, important committee chairs, or rising stars within the party leadership hierarchy. Senate campaigns increasingly receive more donations than House contests. Independent expenditure in Senate races was more than double House races in 2020, with $1,547 million as opposed to $702 million. Pressure groups prioritise Senate campaigns as they yield a 6-year term and therefore a better return on the group's investment. Senators also have greater individual influence as there are only 100 of them and the upper house has slightly more power. A total of 96% of the NRA's 2016 budget was spent on 6 Senate races and the presidential campaign. Many pressure groups, corporations, and wealthy individuals prefer to finance Washington insiders who will maintain the status quo to the benefit of their organisation. This can make it difficult for outsiders to break through and favours a certain type of candidate who is pro-business and generally supportive of the establishment. Hillary Clinton was just that type of candidate and managed to raise far more money in the 2016 presidential campaign than her rival, the anti-establishment Washington outsider, Trump. Her loss demonstrated that there are limits to the power of money and pressure groups in the elections. Iron triangles is the second way that PACs and super PACs can influence the power of pressure groups. Commentators often use the term iron triangles to describe the close relationship between three key participants in the policy-making process: interest groups, Congress, and the executive branch. The theory is that they are bound together in a close network of mutual advantage, meaning that each benefit from the supporters of the others. Interest groups can influence Congress, and particularly members of relevant congressional committees, by making donations to their election campaigns. They are also responsible for a large proportion of employment in certain congressional districts. This particularly applies to wealthy companies or corporate groups. interest groups can also use their influence over Congress to put pressure on the executive branch. Congress is responsible for the funding of executive department policy areas. This gives government an incentive to develop policy that Congress will approve of. Congress can influence interest groups as it may pass legislation that affects them, and it carries out oversight of their activities via congressional committees. Executive departments have considerable power over interest groups as they create the regulations that those groups must follow. The executive branch can also influence Congress by setting the policy agenda and determining how the federal bureaucracy will implement Congress's laws. Iron triangles may apply to any area of government. The two most cited examples are defence and drug companies, which we are going to look at in more detail now. We're going to start with defence, the military-industrial complex. The idea that powerful corporations could have a negative influence on government was raised by President Eisenhower in 1961. Eisenhower warned that the military-industrial complex was growing too powerful and could lead to defence and foreign policies that were not in the public interest. He argued that the developments in the 1950s of a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions had grave implications and could lead to the disastrous rise of misplaced power. Despite being a former general, Eisenhower was keen that the military budget be reduced. Successive governments have been unable to do this, as it has been a political imperative to maintain the US's position as the most powerful global military power. A small number of huge defence firms have become part of the military infrastructure, including Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman. In 1981, Gordon Adams developed the concept of the Iron Triangle in his book The Iron Triangle, The Politics of Defence Contracting. Today, defence companies spend millions on professional lobbyists to induce members of Congress to support their objectives. Lockheed Martin, the largest US defence company, spent $14 million a year on professional lobbyists. The defence industry is dominated by a handful of large companies with operations in many different states and congressional districts. This gives them influence over a large number of members of Congress who are keen to ensure that the companies keep their constituents. When bidding for the contract to build the US's most expensive weapon system, the F-35 fighter jet, Lockheed Martin claimed that the program would create 12,000 jobs over 46 states, putting pressure on those states' members of Congress to support it. Defence companies donate millions to the campaigns of members of Congress. In 2018, these donations totaled more than $30 million. They spread donations over many states and congressional districts, maximising their influence across Congress. Members of Congress who sit on powerful defence committees are likely to receive substantial donations. For example, Joe Courtney, the Democrat congressman for Connecticut's 2nd District, is the chair of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Forces Committee, which oversees Naval and Marine Corps contracts. Defence contractors were the biggest contributors to Courtney's 2019 to 2020 fundraising programme, with donations from multiple companies including Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics and Raytheon. Courtney earned the nickname Two Subs Joe for helping to secure funding for the construction of 2 submarines in his district. Members of Congress may also have personal investments in defence companies. In 2019, 51 members of Congress or their spouses owned a total of $2.3 to $5.8 million worth of shares in defence companies, meaning that they directly profited if defence contracts were awarded to them. This included almost 1/3 of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Defence, which is responsible for deciding how much funding is given to the US Department of Defense to spend on defense contractors. Senator Roy Blunt owned up to 100,000 of stock in Lockheed Martin, so was doubtless pleased by his subcommittee awarding $1.85 billion a contract to the company in 2020. When defence companies become integral to the economy of so many states, the federal government also has a strong incentive to ensure that they prosper. Academic William Hartung described Lockheed Martin as too big to fail, arguing that the company had made itself essential to so many weapon systems that it was militarily and economically imperative for the government to continue to support it with large contracts. The revolving door syndrome also contributes to the formation of iron triangles. Personnel often move from one of these 3 institutions on the triangle to another. In the case of defence, personnel revolve between the big contractors and the headquarters of the Defence Department, the Pentagon. Patrick Shannon served as Trump's Deputy Defence Secretary from 2017 before being made Acting Defence Secretary in 2019. Shannon was previously Boeing's Senior Vice President. Once in government, he oversaw defence spending that directly benefited Boeing, including 20 contracts worth $13.7 million in the month of September 2018 alone. Another example of an iron triangle is drug companies, or Big Pharma, and the FDA. Big pharmaceutical companies pursue strong links with the federal government agency that regulates pharmaceuticals, the Food and Drug Administration, otherwise known as the FDA, and they regulate this with Congress. Pharmaceutical companies focus much attention on members of key congressional committees, such as the House Energy Subcommittee on Health, whose chair, Democrat Anna Eshoo, received hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations from pharmaceutical and health companies in the 2020 election cycle. As with the defence sector, the pharmaceutical industry's relationship with the executive branch benefits from the revolving door. Scott Gottlieb worked for the FDA from 2005 to 2007, before working for several pharmaceutical companies from 2007 to 2017. Trump appointed him to the head of the FDA in 2017. After stepping down in 2019, Gottlieb joined the board of directors of Pfizer, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the US. We're now going to look at the role and significance of PACS and super PACs. The US has a complex system of electoral finance that allows pressure groups to play a central role in elections and political campaigning. The term hard money refers to donations to a particular candidate. Soft money refers to money that is given to a political party or political action committee, but which is not used for the election of specific candidates. Hard money is regulated and limited by the Federal Election Commission, whereas there are no limits on soft money contributions. Soft money includes independent expenditures, which is money spent on campaigning for or against a particular candidate, but without involvement by a candidate or a political party. Pressure groups are able to make unlimited independent expenditures. To manage this, they use two types of organisations: political action committees, otherwise known as PACs, or super PACs. This is the process in how pressure groups work and demonstrate their power. Interest groups make direct contact made by a lobbyist in order to persuade government officials to support their policies or their interest group favours. Many interest groups have PACs. The PACs are tools of the interest groups which help finance the campaigns of the politicians who support the policies of this particular interest group. Pressure groups such as labour unions and other organisations spend billions of dollars each year to lobby Congress and federal agencies. Many lobbying firms are located along Washington's legendary K Street. Others have lobbyists working in-house, and there has been an increasing number of lobbyists being employed to lobby government officials. Twice the amount of money is being spent since 2000. The number of PACs has mushroomed. In 1974, there were 608. In 1996, there was 4,079. There is a criticism of PACs, though, as it protects the elected officials from accountability. It can often lead to corruption, and it leads to inefficiency. We're now going to break down what super PACs are. In the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, this transformed campaign finance as it was a landmark Supreme Court ruling case. The court ruled that the First Amendment right of free speech applies to corporations, unions, and pressure groups in the same way that it applies to individuals. The court's decision allowed pressure groups and corporations to spend an unlimited amount of money on political campaigning, but only in independent expenditure. This led to the creation of a new type of independent expenditure, only political action committees, known as super PACs. Pressure groups and corporations can donate unlimited sums to super PACs, meaning they can raise more money than PACs can. They can also spend an unlimited amount on independent expenditure to campaign for or against political candidates. There is an argument that pressure groups can be more powerful than political parties. Let's evaluate this argument, starting by looking at why pressure groups are more powerful. Iron triangles allow some large corporations and influential interest groups to influence the executive and Congress. Campaign donations and professional lobbyists allow pressure groups to influence members of Congress and the President. Corporations provide essential jobs and become too big to fail. There is the revolving door of key personnel, which allows pressure groups to maintain close relationships with Congress and the executive. Large, well-organised pressure groups can be more focused than large big tent parties, which can contain many conflicting ideas. On the other hand, parties formulate policy for all areas of government, not just a specific sector or issue as pressure groups do. They select and support electoral candidates for the legislative and the presidency, and they wield legislative power in Congress, especially if a party can control both houses. They also can determine federal government policy when their party holds the presidency.